In the last 2 episodes, we found out how I ended up with this engine, and we took it apart, then did some work to find out if we could save it on a budget. The answer to that is a little bit complicated, and since there are so many things to cover, it only makes sense that we take a minute and talk about some of this in detail. For a project like this, you need to lay out a plan, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything will always stick to that. We will end up following most of what is talked about in this video, but some of the details will change. The overall goals that we'll lay out, though, have remained the same.
And with all that said, if it hasn't been clear, I have decided to use this engine. Not just the block. We're actually going to use, well, pretty much everything. We'll take some time to go through and look at each component we're going to be reusing and talk about whether or not it's actually a good idea to reuse that. But I think we're just going to keep this really low buck. We got this block for less than $200 considering it came with the stand. And I think we're just going to try to keep this budget, which is probably a good idea considering all the money I'm trying to spend to get the supercharger back together. Oh, didn't I mention that yet? Yeah, we're going to be putting a B&M 250 supercharger on top of our low budget, kind of sketchy rebuilt engine. And the only thing sketchier than this engine block, well, is the supercharger that I bought very cheap on eBay and am trying to fix up to put on it. You know, what could possibly go wrong with any of this? So to get started talking about parts, I guess we can start here, the engine block. This is a Gen 5 block, which means a couple things. Some are fine with me, some are a little trickier. The first thing this means is that it's not really necessarily compatible with older, more plentiful Generation 4 parts. They changed some of the cylinder head, coolant port, deck kind of configuration here, and with older heads they might not cover the ports all the way, and you can end up with coolant leaks. Now they make gaskets that can theoretically make up that difference in size and cover the ports correctly, but I've heard mixed reports about all that. I'm not 100% sure that's the best idea. It's certainly not ideal. It's not a native fit like it would be with a Generation 4 block, or even actually a Generation 6 block. They kind of changed the design, went back, and made it compatible with everything. But in our case, since we're keeping this as a low-budget project, we're not going to be replacing the cylinder heads anyway, so it doesn't matter all that much. It's also worth noting that, as we saw when taking it apart, this is a flat tappet block. This does not have the factory provisions for roller lifters. There are aftermarket options to put roller lifters in an older block like this, but they're quite expensive, and we are not going that route. The biggest Generation 5 change, and my biggest hang-up with this whole thing, is over here. Or, well, rather it isn't over here. There is no provision for a mechanical fuel pump. That's the way the Firebird is set up right now, and I would really like to keep the mechanical fuel pump. I like how simple it is. I like that it's, you know, mechanical. There's no wires to run or anything like that, but there are some drawbacks to a mechanical pump versus an electric. But anyway, we ended up with this cheap block. This is the price we're going to pay, as we will be switching to an electric fuel pump. So this is not necessarily ideal for what I wanted, but it shouldn't really be a hindrance in the long run. We will be pulling this thing apart and cleaning it the rest of the way, but there is another part that's not going to come off that we will be reusing that a lot of people probably won't like. Just like our last engine rebuild, we will be reusing these cam bearings. However, unlike the last rebuild, this engine appears to have never been taken apart. This seems to be entirely factory as far as I can tell, and it is safe to assume that these are the original GM cam bearings. The other engine had been rebuilt previously and they'd been replaced, and they look pretty much brand new. These have not been quite so fortunate. I just wiped off the oil and honing fluid and stuff so that we can get a better look at the condition here. You can see there's a little bit of a high spot over here where the seam in the bearing is, and another high spot over here on the driver's side. In fact, pretty much the whole top of the bearing has a different wear pattern than the bottom. Right down in here you can see some light scratching and wear. None of this is anything that I can feel, and this is a pretty good representation of the condition that all of the cam bearings are in. And now I can give a whole list of reasons as to why we won't be replacing these, and it's really the same list as in the Blazer 350 rebuild series, although these are a little bit more worn. Basically, if we're being honest, it comes down to one thing: money. I don't have a setup to pull and install cam bearings in any reasonably efficient, non-harmful to the bearings kind of way. I looked into buying this stuff. I need a slide hammer setup that would be compatible with it too, so probably $150, $200, $300. But I think if you're going the budget route, you could kind of piece something together for maybe $150 just to get like the bare minimum for what you're doing at the time. The actual price of the cam bearings isn't a huge deterrent. It would probably be $30, $40 for a set of them. Neither here nor there. I would be willing to pay that. It's more the actual act of installing and removing them. One other big reason that I'm not too concerned about it is we're also not looking for a ton of RPM. Part of this is dictated by reusing stock pistons, which we'll talk about in a little bit, not using forged ones or anything like that. And as well, we're keeping the highway gears in the car. That's right, that may be the most unpopular decision of all of this. We are keeping the 2.42 gears in the rear end. So unless I'm keeping this thing down in first gear, it's probably never going to see 5,000 RPM. Taking a close look at these lobes, they don't look great. There is a little bit of surface rust. That's from sitting in the garage. But the cam bearing surfaces are immaculate as far as I can tell. The lobes are doing pretty well. They're definitely old. They have some miles on them, but I don't see anywhere that's troubling. If this was going to be a naturally aspirated engine, it would absolutely be worth switching cams and putting in a bigger one. But in our case, I'm not looking for a ridiculous amount of horsepower, and we're going with the blower. Having huge cam lobes to open the valves really far is not nearly as big of a deal when you're running forced induction. So you don't have to worry too much about this profile, the factory kind of torquey suburban or truck profile being an issue. I could get a set that is a cam and lifters for probably 100 to 150 bucks for hydraulic flat tappets. And to go along with it, as mentioned earlier, we'll also be using the factory peanut port heads. This particular generation, the style of cylinder head is certainly not popular, but I've also heard enough relatively positive, or at least optimistic things about them, that I'm not worried about performance here. Similar to the camshaft, since we're forcing more air in, the slightly smaller ports or slightly less ideal cylinder head port design doesn't matter quite as much. And because of our low RPM goals, we're not even going to be replacing these springs. We will replace the valve seals and we'll lap the valves, but that's about all we're going to do with these. If we flip these over, we can see that there are some problem areas, but this seems pretty light, and I think we can get all the rust off. I don't think the valves are stuck, or the seats will be too bad. Again, we'll lap them and make sure they'll seal up well. They're not great looking, but we will make do. God, geez, these are heavy. Oh my goodness, okay. And for the sake of time, we're gonna run through the rest of this pretty quick. We will be reusing the camshaft as well. There doesn't appear to be anything wrong with it. All of the lobes look really good, actually. There's nothing visually or feeling-wise wrong with them. I might go through and polish them with sandpaper just like we did with the Blazer, but it would be a real light finish this time since there's no scoring that I've been able to find. The rear seal surface needs to be cleaned up a bit too, but I think it'll be okay since it's using the one-piece seals. That's another difference with the Gen 5 block, is this actually uses one-piece rear crank seals. This has a slightly different timing cover than some other models. So to save some money and not worry about it, this thing seems fine, we're just going to reuse the stock one. This timing pointer, this should be the correct position for the balancer, so we're just going to use this one and cut that off. Anyway, we will definitely be replacing the timing set, because as you can see, one of the less wise decisions they made here, plastic on the timing gears. That's why the chain had so much slop, is because the plastic has worn through, and in some cases actually broken off, like with this tooth. This gear is aluminum. As soon as the plastic teeth are gone, this gear itself was never meant to touch the chain. That's why it wore down a whole heck of a lot. These were just not made to last. So we will definitely be replacing the timing set. The flex plate is good to go. Might give it a coat of paint, but that would be, the most we would actually do with it. It seems totally fine, and it should bolt right up to everything. These valve covers, boy, they would totally work, I think. They seem kind of cheap, but they would work. I just do not like the way they look. They're just they're very old school, very 60s, 70s kind of looking, but just kind of lumpy. I ended up getting some kind of cool looking fabricated aluminum valve covers very cheaply on a very good sale. It may have had something to do with the manufacturing quality and the tolerances because they were pretty warped. So I'm trying to return those right now. I guess by the time this is edited or anything, I'll know how that turns out. But they're also tall valve covers, and they're only an inch taller than these. These are 2 3/4 inches. Those are about 3.5 inch tall overall. But after doing some reading on the subject, I've heard that the brake booster in the 2nd gen Firebirds can get a little bit close to the valve covers, so you really want to use a short one unless you have a rocker setup that demands the taller ones. For that, we actually have some, I believe this is the style that would have been on this from the factory, but we have some GM aluminum low profile style valve covers. I really like the look of these, not these particular ones. These are really rough. We'll have to clean these up, probably sandblast these. It's about 50 bucks. I probably could have found them cheaper somewhere, but I wasn't able to find these in a local junkyard. I looked around for a while, and I wasn't worried about condition since I was going to refinish them either way. But these are also 2 3/4. They're just as low profile, and I really like the way these look, so this is what I would like to go with. We're just going to clean up and reuse the head bolts. They seem fine. None of them broke off, unlike last time. They seem totally fine. We're going to reuse the push rods, rockers. Really everything in here is just going to get cleaned up and reused. Same goes for the main cap bolts and the rod nuts and some of the smaller hardware. A lot of the outside stuff I would like to replace, like timing cover bolts, oil pan stuff, but the interior bolts and head bolts and such we will be reusing. The main caps all appear to be in really good shape. We will be replacing the connecting rod and crank bearings, but that's pretty much all we're doing here. Obviously, we also need to clean the holy heck out of these pistons and replace the rings. Some of these are totally stuck. And despite the condition of the crankshaft, a lot of these connecting rod bearings are not particularly flattering. This one has a pretty decent score right down the center. Like my fingernail catches on that, I can certainly feel it. But for whatever reason, the crank bearing surface looks totally fine. So I'm pretty sure none of these spun or anything, they were all on there correctly. So we should be totally fine just replacing these with factory standard size ones. In fact, these are GM bearings. Let's take a look at one of them here. We can look at the back sides of these and see they are marked GM. GM, well, I made it worse. GM A100 493. I'll have to look a little bit into this, but I'm guessing 93 is the actual model year of this engine. Back to the pistons. Again, these are crusty, but I think they will clean up okay, and we shouldn't have any problems reusing them. All the wrist pins are still moving super freely, even before cleaning them, which is a very good sign. From absolutely every piece of information I was able to find on the L19 engines, this should be somewhere in the 7.5 to 8.25 compression ratio range. So while I originally wanted to change the pistons out and make it even lower compression, kind of seems like that's not going to be necessary. That was one of the motivating factors for the decision to keep most of these parts, is that this thing was already extremely low compression, which is perfect for adding a little bit of boost. And we're not adding much, so it doesn't matter that much, but I definitely don't want to have to run this thing on anything above 93 octane. And even if it is absolute worst case scenario from the numbers I was reading, 8.25 to 1, this should be totally fine on, less than 8 pounds of boost that we're going to be running. And like the cam, over here we have our lifters that we removed. There is a little bit of wear here and there on these. God, I made it worse again. They're not 100% immaculate, but none of them are concave or have any significant looking wear on them. Certainly nothing I can feel. And here we have the balancer that came off. It appears to be in good shape besides the, the rust in that. The rubber at least appears to be okay. We'll clean it up and take another look, but I think we will be totally fine to reuse this balancer. You can see this has the balance weight on the inside that it is supposed to for a 454, and even though we technically could run a crank hub instead of a balancer, since we'll have the blower belt on the front of this thing, which would dampen a lot of the engine's vibrations anyway. But since the 454 is externally balanced, this will probably never see super high RPMs and will mostly be driven on the street. It is a good idea to retain a balancer. Also, crank hubs can get a bit expensive, and this one is already right here. One of the last things to talk about is the oil pan. I'm pretty confident we will not be able to use this. This is definitely truck style deep oil pan. This, from my understanding, from the stuff I've seen and stuff I've read, this little corner here at the bottom will hit the cross member on the 78. So I don't have one yet. I'm still looking for a good, relatively cheap, one-piece main seal oil pan for the thing, but I need one that has more of this kind of profile, is my understanding. Oh yeah, and there are some other parts that we didn't talk about here. Here is the oil pump drive shaft, and if you remember, when we took it apart, there wasn't an oil pump in it. Somebody had already taken that out. So we have a new oil pump, a whole bunch of other new parts. We'll talk about that later.
And for now, that about lays things out. Before we start putting things together, we'll talk about those new parts, but for now, we still have to finish taking it apart. In the next episode, we'll continue with the smaller facets of disassembly and start the cleaning process, which is probably 75% of the work. I can't wait to get started with that. But some things just have to get done.